The forest was thick with rain that morning, its canopy dripping like it mourned something ancient. Birds called out warnings from high branches, and the paths were slick with moss. Amid the hush, a girl moved with quiet steps, feet bare and steady, her eyes scanning the underbrush not for danger, but for something wounded. She had heard it the night before, a groan, faint but human, carried through the wind like a forgotten song. She found him half buried beneath leaves and broken bark, his royal armor dented, blood oozing from his side. A palace guard, alone and far from where he should have been. She knelt beside him, said nothing. Her hands moved with certainty, binding the wound with cloth torn from her own skirt, pressing herbs she had gathered for tea against his skin. He drifted in and out of consciousness, but every time he opened his eyes and saw her face, calm and unshaken, he felt safer. She never spoke, not once, even as he whispered questions. Just looked at him with those strange amber eyes, eyes that made him feel as though silence itself was speaking. When he was strong enough to walk, she helped him to the edge of the forest. Soldiers were already searching. The girl stood in the tree's shadow as they took him, eyes steady, and turned to go back. But the guard stopped them. "Bring her," he said. "The king must see her." No one argued. There was something about her presence that discouraged conflict, something soft but undeniable. She rode to the palace not as a prisoner nor a guest, but something else no one had words for. When they asked her name, she wrote it in the dirt, Leone. The king was a sharp-eyed man, one who had ruled through droughts and uprisings, whose gaze could reduce trembling men to dust. But when he saw the girl brought before him, mud on her ankles, leaves still caught in her braids, he did not bark questions. He only studied her face, then those eyes. They met his without fear, without trembling. They asked nothing. They offered nothing. And yet something inside him shifted. "Why do you not speak?" he asked, not unkindly. She tilted her head, considering. Then she touched her fingers to her lips, then her heart, and finally raised them to the sky. A gesture. A poem in silence. No one understood it, but the king did. Somehow he did. He turned to his court. "Give her a place here," he said. "Not as a servant. As an observer." The court buzzed with discomfort. A girl without lineage, without name or voice, now walked the marble halls of the kingdom. She wore no jewelry, no perfume. She spoke not a word. And yet, ministers hesitated to lie when she stood behind the throne. Ambassadors fumbled their practiced lines when her gaze met theirs. Even the hounds grew still around her, as if sensing something deeper. The king began to ask her to attend council meetings. She sat beside him, hands folded, eyes watching. And though she never raised a voice, her presence shifted the air. When someone proposed war, her gaze turned cold and the king paused. When someone cried injustice, her eyes softened and the king leaned in. She was not a voice. She was a mirror. Some grew to admire her, saying she was the conscience the court had long abandoned. Others whispered things in corners, ugly things. That she was cursed, or a forest spirit wearing a girl's skin. That she had no voice because she had made a pact. That her silence hid knowledge none should have. But Leone paid no mind. She walked the gardens in early morning, fed the birds by hand, helped the cooks gather herbs from the palace wall's edge. She touched the world gently like she knew it could break. One night as the king walked alone, he found her sitting under a fig tree. The moonlight touched her face and her hair shimmered like river reeds. He sat beside her in silence. "You see things," he said quietly. "Things others try to hide." She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw not judgment but knowing. A kind of sorrow that held space for forgiveness. "I have made many mistakes," he whispered. "Buried some truths too deep." Her eyes held his steady. She said nothing, but it was enough. He felt more heard in her silence than in years of speeches and praise. The next day he ordered a new position created, one never seen before in the court's long history. Truth Keeper, he called it. One who hears without words. One who sees without turning away. And so, Leone became something else entirely, not a subject, not an advisor, but a presence. She needed no scrolls. No armor. Her eyes held the weight of kingdoms. And those who dared whisper lies to the king from that day on, always paused, because they knew somewhere in the shadows of the marble throne, amber eyes were watching. At first, the nobles tolerated her. A silent girl, after all, was no threat to men who wore gold on their tongues and jewels in their titles. She had no name that carried weight in court. No father to speak for her. No clan symbols stitched into her robe. She sat behind the king like a breeze, there but easily dismissed. Or so they believed. But it was the king's eyes that began the trouble. Each time he paused during council, he would glance to his right to where Lindau sat, quiet and watchful. And each time he would change course, refusing bribes too sweet to resist, dismissing plans wrapped in polished words, rethinking treaties they had spent months crafting. No one ever saw her whisper. She simply looked. Sometimes her gaze was soft, sometimes cold. But it always held weight, like a stone pressed into the center of a lie. Whispers began in the corners of draped halls and under the cover of garden walks. "She doesn't speak because she doesn't need to," one baron murmured. "She charms him with her eyes." "What else could it be?" another answered. Others nodded, pleased to believe the king was enchanted, not guided. At a midnight gathering, the queen mother sipped bitter root tea and said, "There are old tales, forest girls with snake tongues and golden eyes. She might be one." She came from nowhere. Her attendants gasped, covering their mouths. But not one disagreed. One courtier, whose proposal to raise taxes had been quietly rejected after Lindau's gaze landed on him for too long, grew louder in his discontent. "She's spying," he claimed. "On whose behalf I do not know. But those eyes are not of a girl. They are a trap." Another noble, known for selling favors in shadows, began carrying a small mirror charm around his neck. "To break her spell," he explained, though he could never look directly at her when she walked past. "Sorcery must be met with steel and silver." Still Lindau spoke not a word. She moved through the palace with the same calm as always, acknowledging no insults, no sneers. She fed birds in the courtyard. She helped an old maid with a twisted ankle without waiting for thanks. She listened. But the court was not a place that loved stillness. It was a hive, always humming, always shifting. And Lindau's silence, her refusal to defend herself, only sharpened their suspicion. What kind of girl says nothing when they accuse her of witchcraft? "She is too young to be so wise," a captain muttered. "She has no right." "It's unnatural," a duchess added, "to look into someone's soul and see them flinch. Even my husband avoids her gaze and he fears nothing, except being seen." They did not fear Lindau's silence. They feared what it revealed. One day, during a council meeting about the western border, the king listened as his advisors debated sending more soldiers. They argued, listed numbers, spoke of glory. But before giving his final word, the king turned to Lindau. Her eyes, wide and still, locked with his. She blinked once. Slowly. "No," the king said. "We will send food instead." The room grew cold. Later that night, two courtiers met behind the wine cellar. "She must be undone," one said. "Before she undoes us all." They spread darker stories now, not just that she was enchanted, but that she had made a pact with the spirits that lived beneath the palace stones. That her gaze had cursed the king's decisions. That soon she would speak, and when she did, her voice would shatter the throne itself. The king remained unmoved. He heard the murmurs, saw the hesitation in his council. Still he did not rebuke her. Instead he gave her a seat closer. And that, perhaps, was what truly broke the dam. A small group of nobles drafted a letter. It accused Lindau of spiritual corruption, of endangering the balance between royalty and faith, of casting unspoken spells with her amber stare. It bore 5 seals. It reached the Queen Mother's hands. She brought it to the king. "She frightens them," she said. "They say she is dangerous." The king took the scroll and placed it beside his cup. "Have they forgotten how many lies used to pass through this court unchecked?" "She sees too much," the Queen Mother whispered. "Too clearly." "Good," the king said. "Let them remember how truth feels when it's looking at them." He turned to the window then. Below, in the garden, Lindau sat cross-legged, watching birds dart between branches. One landed on her shoulder. She smiled, not for the court, not for the king. Just to herself. And in that quiet moment, the king realized what they hated wasn't her silence. It was their reflection in her eyes. The great hall of the palace pulsed with color and motion. Red silks rippled above long tables, golden dishes reflected candlelight like small suns, and musicians strummed ancient tunes to keep spirits high. It was a night of celebration, marked to honor a trade alliance secured after months of tense negotiation. Foreign dignitaries sat beside local nobles, goblets raised, laughter echoing like bells through the rafters. But beneath the surface of cheer, suspicion lingered like bitter spice. Eyes shifted across the hall, stopping often at one seat near the king, where Lindau sat, silent and serene, dressed in a soft blue robe. Her hands rested in her lap, unmoving, her gaze calm as ever. She did not eat, nor did she drink. She merely observed as she always did. The Queen Mother watched her closely. Since the petition accusing Lindau of sorcery had reached her hands, she'd grown more guarded, more uneasy. The girl's silence was no longer an enigma, it felt like a mirror pressed too close. As the final course was brought in, smoked goat glazed with honey and tamarind, a voice cut through the rising cheer. "Stop," said Lord Quayu, an advisor known for his sly tongue and obsession with ceremony. He stood slowly, his ringed fingers trembling ever so slightly, though he masked it with a smug smile. "I hesitate to speak during celebration," he said, "but I must question the safety of our table. It has reached my ears that someone unfamiliar with the sacred rites of food has spent time in the kitchen this morning." The hall quieted. Forks paused. The musicians stopped playing. Lord Quayu turned his gaze slowly. "She," he said, pointing without touching, "was seen near the spice room. Alone. No servant accompanied her." All heads turned toward Lindau. She did not flinch. Her eyes met his accusation with silence, her brows neither raised nor furrowed. The only motion was the rise and fall of her breath. The Queen Mother leaned toward the king. "Is this true?" she whispered. "She often walks the grounds early," the king replied. "She harms nothing." "And yet, the tongue of rumor rarely forms from nothing," she said. Quayu stepped forward. "We ask only for reassurance. That the meal before us has not been tampered with. That no influence, dark or divine, has stirred our supper." Whispers spread like smoke. A noblewoman near the front of the table pulled her plate closer to her chest. A foreign ambassador paused mid-sip. A servant boy at the edge of the hall stared at Lindau with wide, frightened eyes. Still she said nothing. "Let her speak," said someone. "Let her defend herself." But Lindau didn't move. Instead she turned to the king. Their eyes met, his lined with tension, hers clear and unbending. She did not plead. She did not shrink. She just looked. The king rose. He walked slowly, deliberately to the grand table. His hand extended and he took the first bite of the goat meat in front of him. A long moment passed. Then he smiled. "It is the finest I have tasted in years," he said. "If this is a curse, may it linger on every dish in this kingdom." A rush of breath escaped from half the hall. Some laughed nervously. Others forced their hands back to their spoons. Lord Quayu looked stricken but quickly bowed his head. "Your Majesty, if you are satisfied." "I am," the king said sharply. "And let me remind you, Lord Quayu, that to accuse someone of poisoning royal food without proof is a crime against the throne." Quayu opened his mouth then closed it. The Queen Mother remained still, but her gaze never left Lindau. Her thoughts whirled like bees in a jar. This girl had spoken no defense, and yet swayed the king with a single glance. That frightened her more than curses or visions ever could. As the music returned and feasting resumed, Lindau lowered her eyes. She had never entered the spice room that morning. She had only stood in the hallway watching the steam rise from pots, breathing in memories of a kitchen long ago, her grandmother's hut, the scent of crushed herbs, smoke curling above clay. But she would not explain that. Explanation was for those desperate to be believed. She had never needed words to be true. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the dishes were cleared, the king stood beside her in the hallway. "They would break you if they could," he said. She looked at him. "But you never give them the satisfaction." She offered the faintest smile, then touched her chest, then pointed to the floor beneath them. "Truth," she seemed to say, "stands by itself." And the king, understanding, nodded. Outside, the stars blinked like watchful eyes. Inside, the court seethed in silence. But Lindau remained steady. They could whisper poison. She would only meet them with eyes. The morning sun sliced through the palace windows like quiet judgment, painting long golden lines across the marble floor of the great hall. On this day the court gathered not for feast or ceremony, but for an accusation. Rumor had spread before the guards could silence it. Lady Noma's ancestral necklace had gone missing, and a noble had placed blame. The boy was young, barely into his manhood. Noble by blood but not by dignity. His name was Dado, a second son with sharp cheekbones and a sharper hunger for power. He stepped into the center of the court with a dramatic bow and the glint of confidence in his eyes. He had practiced this moment. He had rehearsed it in his mirror until the story flowed smooth as honey. "I saw her," he said, gesturing with theatrical disgust, "near Lady Noma's chambers. No one else was there. And later that evening I passed her in the corridor." She looked away quickly. Guilt surely. "When the necklace turned up missing, I knew. It had to be her." The nobles whispered in a wave. Some nodded, eager to believe anything that turned the tide against the quiet girl who unnerved them. Others furrowed brows, glancing to where Lindau sat beside the king as always. She rose slowly. Not at a command, not out of panic, simply because the moment asked it of her. Her movement stirred no drama. No rustle of silks. Just grace and stillness in motion. Dotto's voice held strong at first. He went on about integrity, loyalty, the importance of protecting the Queen Mother's heirlooms. But as Lindau stepped forward, each word landed thinner, weaker. He turned to look at her, he had to, eventually, and met her eyes. There was again. The silence. The stare that did not accuse, did not plead, did not bend. Her amber eyes were not angry. They simply watched. As if they were not seeing him now but peeling back the pages of everything he had ever done. Dotto's fingers twitched. His jaw tightened. He tried to go on. She must have, but something faltered. His voice cracked at the edge. A bead of sweat gathered at his brow and trickled down his temple. The room shifted. Eyes moved from him to her and back again. He glanced at the Queen Mother, expecting reassurance. She looked unmoved. At the king, stone-faced. At Lady Noma, who now looked uncertain, clutching the hem of her dress. "I only say this," he stammered, "because I care for the royal house. I speak only for truth." And still Lindau said nothing. It was not needed. Dotto's mouth opened again. Nothing came out. He looked down. The silence stretched long and thin until finally the king stood. He did not ask for more witnesses. He did not demand proof. He simply raised a hand. "Enough." Dotto looked up, his expression now a mixture of confusion and panic. I'm only—" The king did not shout. He did not explain. "You are to leave by sundown. Take only what you carried in." Gasps scattered around the room. Dotto's mouth fell open. "But, Your Majesty, I didn't." "You lied," said the king. "And worse, you lied poorly." Dotto's knees buckled slightly. He looked at Lindau one last time, her expression unchanged but now unreadable even to him. The guard stepped forward. The young noble was removed. Later, after the room had cleared and the courtiers dispersed like scattered leaves, the Queen Mother approached Lindau in the corridor. "That boy," she said coldly, "was foolish, yes, but not entirely without allies." Lindau did not respond. "I wonder," the Queen Mother continued, "what makes them crumble like that? Fear? Guilt? Or something else?" Still no answer. "You do not speak, but you are louder than the entire court." Lindau's lips parted slightly, and for the first time in weeks she moved her hand, not to gesture, not to point, but simply to place it over her chest. Then she raised her eyes, slow and steady. The Queen Mother, unsettled by the weight of that look, turned and walked away. That evening the king called for no advisers. He sat alone on the balcony watching the wind move the lanterns. Lindau stood nearby, silent as usual. He spoke softly. "It's not magic, is it?" She tilted her head but gave no reply. "It's truth. That's what they see. In your eyes. The truth they spend their lives hiding from." He looked at her. "They're not afraid of you. They're afraid of being seen." Lindau lowered her gaze, a small kindness. And still in the palace the whispers swirled. But this time they were different. Not curses. Not suspicion. But caution. She had not spoken a word. And yet the first lie had fallen. The throne room, once a place of ceremony and composure, trembled with unease. Golden rays filtered through the high stained-glass windows, painting fractured colors on the floor like quiet omens. Courtiers stood still in their finest silks, hands clasped, breaths held as the king entered and took his seat. A goblet, simple yet encrusted with royal sigils, was placed beside him. The morning brew steeped in tradition, laced with herbs known only to the royal kitchen. It had always been safe. Ritual. But this morning something was off. The king raised the goblet, sipped once. Pause. Then came the cough, sharp, hollow, unfamiliar. The second cough echoed across the hall like a drumbeat. The goblet slipped from his hand, clanging to the floor, amber liquid spilling across the white marble like a prophecy unfulfilled. Gasps burst through the hall. The Queen Mother stood. The guards rushed forward. The physician knelt beside the goblet, dipping his finger in the remnants and tasting carefully. His face went pale. "Poison?" he whispered. A cold wind passed through the open arches, and though no one moved, the court turned as one, every eye drawn to a single figure standing near the columned wall, silent, still, watching. Lindau. She had not moved. Had not spoken. As always. But that was the problem. Whispers slithered like snakes across the room. It must be her. She never speaks, perhaps to hide her spells. She bewitched the king and now she's turning on him. She's always watching. Never blinking. No proof. Just fear. The Queen Mother nodded once. Guards moved in without hesitation. Lindau did not run. She did not resist. As they bound her wrists and pulled her away, her eyes remained calm. Her gaze found the king, now sitting upright, breath returned, fury blooming on his brow. But he said nothing. The court, desperate for someone to blame, filled the silence for him. In the dungeon, the stone walls pressed cold and damp against her skin. Rats moved in the shadows. A single torch flickered outside the bars. She sat on the ground, her knees pulled close, her eyes watching the flicker as if it too might reveal something. Hours passed. Then footsteps. Heavier than the guards. Measured. Familiar. The king. He dismissed the guard with a wave and stepped into the cell alone. No armor. No robe. Just a man with too many questions. He stood before her for a moment, silent. She looked up. Her eyes met his. In that stillness something shifted. The sharp suspicion he carried into the cell unraveled. He remembered the first time he had seen those eyes, calm as a lake at dawn. He remembered how, when the court spun lies and schemes, her gaze had always steadied him. He remembered the stillness she brought. The way liars stumbled under her stare, and how truth clung to her presence like a second skin. "You knew," he said softly. "You knew I wouldn't die." She blinked once. He crouched in front of her, staring into the same amber depths that had silenced a room full of nobles. "Why didn't you say anything?" Her silence answered, "Because truth doesn't always need sound." He stood. His voice echoed slightly in the narrow corridor outside her cell. "This isn't right." He turned on his heel, fury returning, not at her but at them. At the fear. At how quickly silence had been turned into suspicion. "Open the gates," he ordered the guard. "But, Your Majesty." "I said open them." Within the hour an emergency meeting was called. The king demanded a reinvestigation. The goblet was examined not by the royal physician, who had curiously left the palace, but by a neutral apothecary from the outer towns. Fingerprints were found on its base, too large to be Lindau's, too callous to belong to a servant. Witnesses who had seen her near the dais were questioned again. Timelines shifted. Inconsistencies emerged. Then came the girl. A servant, barely 12, trembling as she stepped forward. "I saw him," she whispered. "The general." He handled the goblet. The room froze. "You're sure?" She nodded. He told the steward he was checking for cracks. The general, high in rank, tight with the Queen Mother, was summoned. But he was already gone, fled in the night, leaving behind only a ring and a broken promise. The king's jaw clenched. The court had been wrong. Again. And Lindau had not needed to prove herself. She had simply waited for truth to catch up. The next morning, Lindau was released without ceremony, without apology, but not without notice. The nobles could no longer meet her eyes. Some bowed as she passed. Others stepped aside, unable to endure the gaze that had seen them at their worst. The king met her near the courtyard steps. He said nothing. She nodded once. And in that nod the kingdom realized, silence was not weakness. It was clarity. And from that day forward the king began to speak less. He started to watch, to listen. To let silence speak first. Because if Lindau had taught him anything, it was this. Eyes don't lie. The throne room no longer echoed with careless laughter or hollow praise. After the failed poisoning, something heavier than silence settled into the marble, suspicion. It clung to the walls, lived in the corners, crept into conversations and smiled through fake concern. The king did not call court the next morning. Instead, he sat alone in the inner chamber, staring at his reflection in a bronze dish. He was alive. Saved. But not by chance and not by the voices surrounding him. No. It had been her eyes. Lindau's. She had said nothing. And still her silence screamed over their lies. He remembered how calm she'd looked in the dungeon, like she was waiting, not for rescue but for the truth to wake up. And now it had. A child's trembling words had unveiled the real traitor. General Mbeki, a trusted advisor, now vanished like a breath in fog. The king stood and called for his most trusted guard. "Bring her to me," he said. But not through the hall. The garden entrance. She arrived cloaked, her footsteps soft as wind over water. Lindau bowed slightly, but her eyes held no fear. Only patience. "Will you walk with me?" the king asked. She nodded. They strolled among the whispering trees, petals falling around them like secrets. He didn't speak at first, and neither did she. But her presence soothed him, a clarity in a world too loud with deception. "I see now," he said finally. "You never needed to speak. You've always listened. What? I've been blind even with so many voices guiding me." Lindau looked at him, eyes deep as a well. He stopped walking. "I want to see as you do," he said. "So from today I will learn silence." And he did. That week the king held no speeches. When courtiers brought complaints, he let them speak, then dismissed them with no reply. He watched instead. Observed the fidgeting hands, the averted eyes, the twitching mouths of the guilty. It unsettled everyone. The court, once confident in its noise, found itself drowning in its own echoes. The nobles whispered in hallways, unsure if silence was power or punishment. Accusations stopped mid-sentence. People chose their words like precious stones, each syllable held up to the light before it left their mouths. Lindau, reinstated and seated beside the king during council, said nothing. Yet her presence alone made the room feel colder, sharper. She was no longer the silent girl. She was something else now. A mirror. A shadow. A reckoning. One by one masks began to fall. The Minister of Grain was caught hoarding royal reserves. The treasurer's accounts were found falsified. Even the Queen Mother, once so composed, now refused to meet the king's gaze. Each time a lie was caught, Lindau's eyes had lingered just a moment longer. It became a legend. Children whispered that she could see thoughts. That the reason she never spoke was because words were too small for what she understood. Servants walked straighter around her. Guards saluted with tighter fists. She never asked for power. But it found her, drawn to her silence like birds to still water. And still she said nothing. Until the day came when the king looked to her not for judgment, but for guidance. A noble stood before them, accused of bribery. He denied everything with polished charm and a trembling brow. Lindau's eyes met his. And for the first time she spoke. 2 words. "He's afraid." The room stilled. Not because of the accusation, but because she had broken her silence. The voice was soft, unassuming. Yet it carried like thunder. It told the court that silence had been a choice. And now the choice was broken. Because she was no longer waiting. She was warning. The noble collapsed to his knees. "I lied," he confessed. "Forgive me." The king did not smile. He merely looked at Lindau. And she nodded once. Outside the clouds parted. The court exhaled. But the fear remained, not of Lindau nor the king, but of what might be heard in silence if they stopped talking long enough to listen. From that day, every royal meeting began in silence. 10 breaths. No words. Just the sound of eyes searching hearts. Those who couldn't bear it resigned. Those who remained began to change. And though Lindau returned to her quiet, seated beside the king without title or command, she was no longer ignored. She was watched, revered, even feared. Because in the shadows where truth once hid, she had become a lantern. And in that light, the court trembled, knowing their masks would never fit the same again. The court had just begun to settle from the storm of the mirror trial when a strange presence arrived at the gates. He came with no escort, no title, and no eyes, at least not ones that saw the way others did. His name was Tomo, a blind man wrapped in tattered robes that smelled faintly of herbs and rain. He leaned on a twisted staff carved with ancient runes no one could fully read. The guards hesitated to let him through, but when he opened his mouth to speak, their swords dropped, not from fear but from an unfamiliar peace. "I have come to see the girl who sees," he said. Word spread like wildfire. By sunset, the royal court gathered again in the courtyard, this time not by decree but by curiosity. Even the Queen Mother, who had remained cloistered since the mirror shattered, emerged from her chamber, face composed but eyes wary. Lindau was already there, seated in silence as always. Tomo stood before her. Though blind, he bowed low, not just to her but to something deeper, older, that he felt pulsing in the ground around her. "You do not speak," he said softly, "but you hear things in silence most of us miss." She tilted her head slightly, acknowledging him. He turned to face the court, staff tapping the stones like a slow drumbeat. "You call her cursed," he said. "But the truth is, she carries what was once known as the Ember Sight, a gift passed through bloodlines long forgotten. Her ancestors were the peacekeepers of the storm courts. They saw lies before they were spoken and truths buried so deep they never reached the mouth." Murmurs rose. Some scoffed. Others looked nervously at Lindau. Tomo continued. "She does not see skin or titles. She sees the trembling beneath smiles. The breath before betrayal. The eyes that smile while hands prepare harm. Her silence is not weakness. It is the mirror you dare not face. He paused. And now I will tell you something no one else in this court can know. Not even she. He turned toward the Queen Mother. When you were 16, he said, you stood before a mirror in your mother's chamber, wearing a crown that wasn't yours yet. You swore to never cry again. You wiped away your tears with the edge of your robe, and that night the true heir fell ill. Gasps erupted. The Queen Mother's hand flew to her chest. That memory, Tomo said, never left the glass. You locked it away. But she, he gestured to Lindiao, can see what mirrors remember. The Queen Mother trembled. She opened her mouth, perhaps to deny. But the moment her gaze met Lindiao's, something in her shifted, a crack like in the mirror days before. A breath caught between memory and confession. She looked away. Tomo nodded as if satisfied. I cannot lie, he said. And neither can she. That is our burden. And our offering. A young court scribe, voice shaking, stepped forward. How do we know you speak truth? Tomo turned toward him. Because your brother was not lost in the river, he replied. You still have his letter hidden in the hem of your cloak. The one that said he was leaving to join the hill rebels. The scribe staggered back, pale as ash. The court was silent again, a different silence now. Not of fear but reckoning. Lindiao looked at Tomo and for the first time she smiled, just barely. Tomo turned back to her. You do not need to speak, he said. You need to stay. He faced the king next. If you still rule by ears alone, you will miss the truth standing before your eyes. The king bowed his head. I will build a new chamber, he said quietly, where silence is sacred, and lies are unwelcome. Tomo smiled, then placed a wrinkled hand over Lindiao's heart. This is where your voice lives, he whispered. Not in words. In knowing. He turned to leave, tapping his staff once against the stone. Remember, he said without turning back, the greatest truths are spoken without sound. And then he was gone, vanishing into the crowd like smoke in the wind. Lindiao remained seated, unmoved. But every eye in the court now looked at her differently. Not as a girl who would not speak, but as the woman who saw them before they saw themselves. The great courtyard of the palace was filled that morning, not with soldiers or nobles posturing, but with villagers, elders and children perched on shoulders, their eyes fixed on the king's platform. Bells had rung through the night after the fire. Whispers danced like smoke through the streets. The silent girl had walked through flames. The Queen Mother had wept in her arms. Something had shifted in the air. The king stood tall beneath the stone arch, the sun casting a glow behind him. But even in his regality, all eyes were drawn to the figure beside him. Lindiao. She wore no crown, no jewels, no robe. Just a pale linen dress, simple and clean. Her eyes, amber and steady, gazed softly at the gathered crowd. She said nothing, but her presence quieted even the rowdiest children. People held their breath, not out of fear but out of reverence. The king lifted his hand. All of you have heard tales of her, he began. Some of you whispered warnings. Others told lies. Even I once doubted what could be known by eyes that speak but never shout. He turned toward Lindiao and his voice softened. But I have watched kingdoms fall through deceit. I have seen armies rise on false promises. And I have seen this girl, without one single word, unravel 1,000 deceptions. Pause. She walked into fire and returned carrying truth. She stood in silence while others screamed injustice. She looked into guilt and didn't flinch. Tell me, people, who among you has done the same? No one answered. The king continued, voice firm. Today I name her Royal Truthkeeper, a title never before held because none were ever worthy. She will speak not through sound but through presence. She will sit beside the queen. She will watch. And where lies try to grow, she will be the mirror that cracks them. There was a beat of silence, then thunderous applause. But Lindiao did not bow, did not cry. She only looked out over the sea of faces, and many felt as though she looked into them, not at them. Among the crowd, those who had once gossiped about her now pressed hands to hearts. The market women who once turned their backs on her now wiped away tears. The young noble who had lied about her theft stood with his head down, ashamed to even meet her gaze. Even children who had once mimicked her silence with cruelty now watched in awe, whispering, "She holds the king's truth." The Queen Mother stood from her chair and walked to Lindiao, placing a small pendant around her neck, a circle of polished wood carved with the ancient symbol of balance. The voice of the court, she said loud enough for all to hear, now lives in her eyes. That evening, as torches were lit and drums filled the square, celebrations began, but not with wine or dancing. Instead, the people lined up, one by one, to kneel before Lindau, offering words of thanks, apology, or simply sitting in silence beside her. And she listened to all of them, her gaze soft, never judging, only seeing. A boy brought her a flower he had stolen earlier from the palace garden. "It was wrong," he whispered. She looked at him and smiled, and the boy felt lighter. An old woman whispered, "My son once accused you." Lindau nodded gently, and the woman sobbed into her lap. In a corner, the king watched it all, not as ruler but as witness. He had once believed armies and advisors were his kingdom's spine. Now he understood, truth was. And it had chosen to wear no armor, no title, just quiet eyes and an unwavering heart. By the time the moon was high, Lindau had not spoken once, yet the entire court was quieter, more honest than it had been in years. From that day forward, no major decision was made without Lindau present. Her chair stood beside the throne, slightly lower but always filled. Nobles learned to measure their words before her gaze. Warriors swore oaths not to the blade but to her eyes. And children who once mocked silence learned that it too could be mighty. For the kingdom had finally learned what the king now understood deeply. Words can be twisted. Crowds can be fooled. But the eyes that see without needing to speak, they hold the weight of kingdoms. The moon was high, yet the king could not sleep. Long after the drummers stopped, long after the fires in the square died down, he paced the stone corridors of his palace, footsteps echoing softly like memories he couldn't quiet. Something had settled in him that day, not grief, not joy, but a kind of knowing that left his chest heavy. He walked until he reached the courtyard garden, where a single figure sat beneath the sacred fig tree, her amber eyes glinting softly in the moonlight. "Lindau." She turned before he spoke, as though she had already heard his thoughts. She always did. The king gave a soft chuckle as he sat beside her on the cool marble bench. "I've lived through war," he said, "and politics. Betrayals that nearly tore this land apart. I've heard thousands of speeches and lies dressed in silk. Yet your silence has done what no army or law could." Lindau looked at him, unblinking. "Come." Waiting. The king hesitated, then asked the question he had never dared speak aloud before. "Why do you never speak?" She reached for the wooden board and charcoal she kept in her cloth pouch and wrote, slowly and carefully. "Words can be bent. Eyes cannot." He read it twice. Then again. And again. Something cracked in him. Not from pain, but from the release of something ancient and buried. His lips trembled. Tears began to fall. At first, he turned away in shame, the king crying like a child before someone younger than his own daughters. But Lindau simply sat beside him, steady as ever. She did not reach to wipe his tears. She did not offer false comfort. She simply remained, and that was enough. "You remind me," he finally whispered, "of who I wanted to be when I was a boy. I thought ruling meant commanding, winning, being feared. But I see now, true power comes from being still, from seeing clearly, from refusing to become what others expect." Lindau blinked slowly, then placed the board in his lap. There was one more sentence written beneath the last. "Truth does not shout." The king laughed softly, wiping his eyes with the edge of his sleeve. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He turned to her, eyes gentler than they had ever been. "I will not live forever, Lindau. My son is learning to govern. He will wear the crown when I am gone. But you—" He paused. "You must never leave this court. Not as a ruler but as its conscience. As its truth." She tilted her head, questioning silently. "You will sit beside the throne," he said, "and remind the future what silence can see. You will outlast dynasties. You will be the mirror that liars fear. You will be the stillness in the storm." He reached into his robe and removed a thin chain, not gold but copper, ancient and worn. On its end was a carved eye made of smooth stone. "This belonged to my great-grandmother," he said. "She was called the Watcher of Wills. They say she saw rebellions before they rose. She wore this to remind her court to see deeper." He placed the chain around Lindau's neck. "The stone eye rested just above her heart. Now it belongs to you." She touched it gently, her fingers brushing its cool surface. Then, for the first time in her memory, she reached out, not to write, not to gesture, but to take his hand. Their fingers locked. Silence held the moment like a sacred veil. Above them, the wind stirred the fig leaves. A soft, wordless lullaby passed between the branches. It carried the scent of old soil, warm bark, and something unseen but deeply known. The king closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Lindau squeezed his hand once. No more words were needed. From that day forward, her seat beside the throne was carved with the same eye that hung from her chest. Every ruler after that, prince, queen, or regent, was sworn in only after standing before her gaze. Policies were passed with her watching. Battles were delayed because of her blinking once. The court never again forgot. When truth is silent, it does not mean it is absent. And in the far future, when bards sang of kings and wars, rebellions and alliances, they always ended with the same line. But it was the girl who never spoke who taught them all to listen.